Hello. Oh, yes, I have my unmute on. Hi, everyone. Hi, Mike and Seth and ML and Rob, although I saw you a little bit before Rob and Faith. We have maybe a little bit of Faith's face. It's going to come in here and she's in a dark black room. And hi, Seth. Hi, everyone. And Daniel and Joshua. Welcome to another Omega Male. This is a men's forum where everyone is welcome because here I am, a woman. Tonight, I'm going to pass it off to you shortly, but a couple reminders from Team WeDeepen. Number one, this is being recorded. So you are consenting to be recorded here. We record this experience to not hoard information, to get other people access to what you hear here. And if there's something that you hear this evening that you want to share with a friend afterwards, it will be uploaded to YouTube afterwards, as well as there's a link right now in the chat for us on Facebook Live. So you can access that if you wish or choose to. If you like, in your name tag, you can all rename yourself and you can add your Instagram or another method of connection, maybe an email address or something. That's totally up to you. You can even add it midway through if you decide that maybe there's someone's that here that you'd want to connect with later on. We do encourage that. WeDeepen is a relationship platform, our relationship community. Here you'll find people who desire to have healthy, meaningful, loving relationships. And why I say relationships, we also just want interactions. I would just love a nice world where we can walk out and we look at each other in the face and we see how beautiful everyone's existence is and we say hello. So you don't have to form deep relationships with everyone in this place, but you get to come and see each other's faces again and again each time. I think that's all I have to share. After this experience, I'm going to drop a survey link in the chat, as well as you'll get it by email too. If you registered through WeDeepen, which then sends you through Eventbrite, you'll get a survey link afterwards. And please just take 3 minutes or so to provide feedback. It helps us to continue to mold and develop this experience so that it meets your needs and you're excited about it. You want it to share it with others. Before I do turn it over to Dan, does anyone have any questions? We'll be together for, this is a 90-minute experience. So our plan is to get you out of here on time. And this is the container we're going to send. Welcome everyone into space. I'm going to pass it over to Daniel Mackenzie. Some of you know as Dan, some of you know as Daniel. I know him as both. Daniel is the creator and the guide of Omega Male. It's an interactive experience here on the podcast, or on the WeDeepen network, as well as Daniel has a podcast that is coming out too, Omega Male Podcast. And he has been studying, I would say, as long as I've known Dan, and even prior to that, has been studying humanity, the human psyche, anthroposophy, if I said that correctly, as well. And a very curious individual. I know that some of you guys are dear friends of him, so he likes to go deep and have very deep conversations about topics that really, at the end of the day, connect us, which is so important these days. And Daniel's also a musician. The music that was playing that welcomed us into this evening is by Daniel. And happy to have you here guiding us. I'm going to pass it over, and I'm excited to experience this Omega Male with you all this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I want to send it right back and thanks the WeDeepen team, Christina, everybody, Kelly, Taylor, David, Jamie, I think is the newest member. You guys have been great in hosting this program on the platform WeDeepen, and I encourage everyone on this in this Zoom room to check out their other programs. They're doing really exciting things and constantly changing the format and trying out new forms, and it's a wonderful place to have be hosting this show. And yes, this is Omega Male. I am the Omega Male. Just kidding, of course. Omega Male has nothing to do with me particularly, or with any individual, or even like with a singular type of man. I just sort of came up with this concept to try to really provide inspiration for envisioning a more expansive, balanced, evolved kind of future ideal for men that we men of the present feel is worthy of striving towards. That's the simplest way to put it. And something to replace maybe what I would call the very narrowly defined, archaic archetype of the alpha male that doesn't seem to be working for us anymore. So it's a more dominance-oriented archetype that I think we're evolving beyond. So that's essentially the Omega Male concept. Yes, I do have some really wonderfully familiar faces here and some people I don't know. So for those of you who don't know me, in my other life, I'm a music producer and a songwriter, but I've also spent a good 3 decades working in spiritual self-development, what Christina was calling studying humanity. I guess that's an interesting, nice way to put it too. But like really working in depth with anthroposophy. And I wish I had time to explain what that was, but it's worth a good Google. And for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been doing a lot of presenting and writing and some personal counseling in this space. And actually in the last year or so, some podcasting too. This particular, my work is rooted in anthroposophy and also to some degree in nonviolent communication, which is going to come into focus tonight, which I'm really super excited about. And, there's a bunch of other things that have informed what I'm doing, everything from the Shakespeare, the Sufi poets, yoga, the Beatles, it's all part of my soup. So this particular endeavor, the Omega Male on WeDeepen is connected to the podcast that Christina mentioned and to a book project that I'm working on. It seemed like a really exciting and kind of novel idea to me to kind of present and talk through some men's issues, but in a forum that was available to not just men and women, just everyone really who's interested in talking about those things, rather than just calling it a men's group. And it's also providing me with kind of an opportunity to sort of road test some of the ideas that I'm working with in the book and in the podcast. And that's been really cool. So the format basically is I'm going to introduce the theme, share some thoughts and ideas about it, and then I'm going to introduce our valued guest, and he's going to talk a little bit, we're going to talk, and then eventually it's going to sort of open up into a more open conversation. We usually have these rules of engagement around how that conversation looks. It's basically, in a nutshell, we call it be cool, be kind, and be bold. There's usually a nice graphic that goes with it, but since I'm in charge of these things, we probably won't be seeing a lot of the graphics. It just essentially means a group like this of wonderful people probably don't even need to be told this, but just being mindful of, oh, here it comes. There you go. All right, so we might as well run through it. Be cool just means try not to interrupt people. Be mindful of how long you're speaking for. Be kind means even if you feel passionately in disagreement with something someone has said, feel free to contradict them, but try not to attack personally. And be bold if you feel self-conscious about sharing something or you're just on the fence. These things can be a little intimidating, even though we're all sitting here. I'm here with my pajama bottoms on, but still, it's these are loaded topics, and so I just want to encourage anyone to share. And if you can't get a word in edgewise, just sort of drop a line into the chat. You can comment there, or just say you're trying to get a word in, and we'll make space for you. And that's about it. So why don't I just dive right into our topic. Violence and nonviolence, I guess. I think I was calling it the daily challenge that men face. Of course, I'm tailoring it to men, but it's a discussion that's going to hopefully apply to everyone here. But let's start out on a positive note. And before we go into the negative things, I want to just pay tribute a little bit to how much humanity actually has evolved in so many wonderful ways, just for perspective, to kind of set it up a little bit. I'm thinking about just the world of medicine alone right now. We're in the process of basically halting a pandemic through the sort of global deployment of several vaccines. We do heart transplants, we do brain surgery, we do like bionic limb replacements. I can say just for today, like I can literally stop what would be a debilitating migraine in its tracks with a tiny little pill called Imitrex that I'm very grateful for. So just that world alone is staggering. But we have, we build these skyscrapers that can withstand earthquakes. We have planes that can fly faster than the speed of sound, and planes that can take people from one continent to another, hundreds of people in one plane. We each of us have these little handheld things that used to be like the stuff of science fiction, like not 20 years ago. This was like the Jetsons. You actually have a video phone that you can carry around with you, but it's not just a video phone. It's a global navigation device. It's a dating service. It's a stock market monitor. It's a tarot card reader. It's a workout coach. It's whatever you want it to be. And almost everyone on the planet has one of these. So that's pretty advanced, I think, as far as the civilizations go. You have these very sophisticated, highly developed governmental systems. We have international alliances that extend into space programs. We literally just put not the first, but like yet another rover on Mars, another planet. Like this is pretty impressive stuff. We have we have what do we call them? Non-fungible tokens. We have Bitcoin. We have TikTok. I mean, TikTok maybe is not the best representation of our evolution, but you get what I'm saying. There's a lot of wonderful things that humans have been able to achieve. And yet, in some respects, I probably would have thrown in like, human rights and stuff, but I don't think we're quite there yet with, women's rights and human rights and gay rights. So those aren't braggable yet, but we've achieved a lot. And yet in certain realms, we are super backwards still. Like by and large, we're a very violent species as species go. And so that's what we're kind of unpacking tonight. If you think about it, we use violence to enforce our laws. In many cases, at least in this country, we actually use violence and murder to punish our violent crimes. We settle international disputes with war, which is essentially massive scale violence. We settle gang turf wars with violence. We take in fictional violence and sometimes non-fictional violence in our entertainment with like super graphic TV shows and films. We have entire sports, many of them that are just really designed around human beings attacking one another. Sometimes there's a ball involved, very often not. There's thousands of video games that basically glorify, glamorize, and sex up like any imaginable type of violence and simulate it for us. We, interestingly, in the last year or two, we now have, of course, most civil protests are peaceful, but we have situations now where some people are using violence to protest against the use of violence. And to go even more meta, we've seen situations where we have violence being used to subdue people who are using violence to protest the institutional use of violence. So that's basically where we're at with violence in our society. There was a little dispute over what the tagline for this should be. My original tagline was, a violence versus nonviolence, a daily choice for men. It was meant to be provocative. I guess what I was implying was, and we were talking about this just before the session started, for most of us, extreme physical violence or any kind of physical violence isn't really part of our daily lives, right? Most of us are not, mixed martial arts fighters or active duty soldiers, but the many subtle forms that violence manifests in is absolutely, I would argue, a daily experience for most people. Whether you're, slamming a door or you break something in frustration, you yell at somebody, you give somebody the finger, you curse at somebody, you just storm out of a room because you're frustrated. And even for those of us who are like zenned out enough to not really ever or often do those things, the way we speak to each other can be violent. Just using aggressive, blaming, shaming language is a form of violence. We're going to get into that a little bit. And I think something that's not to be discounted is the violent thoughts we have, which give birth to everything else. If you think about it, if you could have like a transcript, like a printed transcript of all of the thoughts you have, any person in the course of a day, I think we'd be shocked at each other's thoughts, but we'd probably be mostly shocked at our own thoughts, at like really seeing what we think maybe in a split second. If you just tune into like the next time someone cuts you off in your car, like what goes through your head just for a moment, or if they think you cut them off and they're yelling at you, someone's road raging at you. When I first moved to LA, I was just shocked by how hostile drivers were and selfish. And in my 20s, when I had less control over my anger impulses, I really thought at one point, like, I should just carry around a carton of eggs and I'm just going to throw a raw egg at someone next time they pull a maneuver like that. Now, I never did that. It's a crazy thought. It's just a thought I had. But like, even now in I like to think that I'm just much more evolved and zen about things, but I will have a momentary thought where I'm just like, I just want to throw an egg virtually at some driver. It's a violent thought, especially as a dad now. I mean, when I'm putting my kid in my car in the driveway and someone flies down our residential street at 60 miles an hour, like I don't know that I'd want to see a transcript of those thoughts that I have. And so I guess what I'm saying is, on some level or another, we all have these charming little thoughts. I mean, your partner, the person you are in relationship with, the person you're supposed to love the most, they might say something that pisses you off, and you don't have to imagine strangling them for it to be a violent thought. You might just sit there and say, oh, is that okay? And you're thinking, fuck you, So we all have these little thoughts, and men and women. But I would say that having acknowledged that this is a universal problem, it's a little bit more of a challenge for men, and for a couple of reasons. I would say biologically speaking, you could argue that testosterone comes into the picture. But even more than that, we have hundreds of thousands of years of cultural, archaic, ancestral programming that kind of permits us and even like instructs us to be violent in certain ways. And I think that happens in indirect and direct ways. Indirectly, I would say, and I think this is just beginning to shift now with the youngest generations, but by and large, most men in the past were raised as little boys to think that that almost the entire spectrum of emotions beyond anger are girly, like anything that might connote weakness, so sorrow or hurt feelings or doubt or fear, apprehension, all of these things are sort of culturally considered feminine, and we might not say it directly to our kids, but this whole boys don't cry is a major theme in men's upbringing. And so what it leaves men with is a very limited span of legitimate, like, masculine emotions. And really anger is the, like, categorically male masculine emotion that we're permitted to have. And so for a lot of men, what otherwise would be a very rich and nuanced emotional experience, at least speaking broadly and culturally, gets translated into anger. And I'll bet you even the most, and there's some real, like, very evolved new agey guys that I see on this screen, but I bet you any one of us can point to times when we've been acting in anger or speaking in anger, and then ultimately realized, oh, I was actually really sad about something. I was really feeling worried or fearful about something, and it just manifested as anger, because that's kind of what we're trained in. And not only that, I think even some of our direct programming is like programs us to consider at least that like violence is a viable option. It wasn't like, I mean, if anyone who's watched Hamilton, that wasn't too long ago when it was just a social custom, even in like the politest society. If someone like offends you enough, you could just, invite them to a duel and then like shoot guns at each other, potentially one killing the other over a personal offense. And I think we still have vestiges of that. Of course, we're mostly not doing duels unless maybe you're in a gang, in which case that probably something similar does happen. But we do have, it's like, it's not the go-to option, but men on some level are raised with this idea that like it might be appropriate at some point to punch someone, particularly if you can sort of cloak it as self-defense, right? Like if you're defending yourself, anything goes. And that notion, I think, is in itself problematic. The notion of defense, it's sort of a linguistic way to kind of take the edge off what we're talking, the condoning of violence. If you think about this terminology like defense minister or secretary of defense or the defense department, right? If we really look at what these things are, the defense department is basically the war department. It's the mass murder and mass destruction department. And you can't really, if you look at an F-16 bomber or a machine gun or an armed drone or a landmine, a hand grenade, a bazooka, these are all things like, it's hard to look at these things and go, well, this is a defense device. It's just like, in case someone comes after me. Like we have like very sophisticated destructive weaponry. And so kind of our language around that is a bit of a ruse. I think, and this is not to knock martial arts. I've been interested in martial arts at different times in my life, but with the exception of maybe Tai Chi and Aikido, martial arts in this country are presented as self-defense forms. But if you watch them, very often I see this is just like people learning very sophisticated, brutal ways to kind of maim and damage each other. So there's a lot of stuff that gets sort of passed off and sanctified as legitimate violence. And so, the overarching question here, I'm homing in on it now, is like, since we've been so advanced and so sophisticated in certain aspects of our evolution, and we're so kind of backward in this respect, it's, I guess, tempting for some people to think like, well, this is just human nature, right? Like there's some kind of immutable, unchangeable aspect of human being that's just never going to be any different. We should just sort of deal with it. Spoiler alert, I'm for anyone who's attended any of these Omega Male things, I do that. My belief is that human evolution is actually about our increasing capacity to self-direct our evolution and to transcend those lower impulses like that. And I think there's evidence to support that. And so the question for me is, well, if we're able to, as individuals and even collectively, ultimately transcend this inclination towards violence, what would that look like? How does that work? I think when people think of nonviolence, the first things that come to mind are like, oh, well, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, right? And with good reason, because these are kind of the icons of nonviolence. And I mean, if you just see, I saw the movie Selma recently, which is one of the great movies about Martin Luther King Jr. And just to see this one particular scene comes to mind, where you see these nonviolent, very brave human beings of all ages and shapes and sizes marching across the Pettus Bridge. And they basically are met with and absorb this incredibly brutal, violent attack from the police without fighting back. And it's one of the most heartbreaking, shameful scenes I've ever seen in film. And yet it's really inspiring to me, because to just see an image of a human being like rise to the occasion of being able to not fight back, even in the face of the onslaught of violence. And so there have been these little historical figures and these moments in history where we do have like examples of people transcending that. I'd be remiss not to mention good old Jesus with his turn the other cheek philosophy. And, that's really been like a tried and true kind of biblical soundbite. But anyone who's ever been punched in the face knows that's really hard. It's like really hard to turn the other cheek when someone punches you in the face. And so how do we take these sort of iconic, almost inaccessible images of people and beautiful philosophies of nonviolence and somehow translate that into a practical system or a way of developing a real capacity for peacefulness and nonviolence? That's what I want this discussion to be about. And in a way, it's such a broad topic and a broad challenge. I know that we'll barely scratch the surface of it, right? It's a lot to cover, and you could parse it into what's systemic violence and institutional violence, what's personal violence, and we can really talk about anything that comes up. But I want to start from the point of view of this individual challenge of violence, and not just for men, but for women. What can we do to, and I think it's twofold. It's like, how can we expand the horizons of our experience and our patterns of behavior in ways that move away from violence and towards peacefulness? And also the second component being like, how can I cultivate on a day-to-day basis, kind of an inner state that is more conducive to peacefulness and less to violence. And so in terms of the first, and this is when I'm about to introduce our guest, it was literally life-changing for me 12 or 13 years ago when I was introduced to nonviolent communication. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, but some of you might not know what that is. It's basically a revolutionary, I would call it, a revolutionary system of communication between human beings, of conflict resolution, just an approach to life, really, that was developed by an amazing guy named Marshall Rosenberg. And when a very dear friend of mine introduced this to me 12 or 13 years ago, I just dove into it because at the time I was dealing with a lot of extremely volatile, hostile situations in my family dynamics. And even though I always consider myself, I think, not to toot my own horn, but I was always a pretty good moderator, mediator, negotiator. And the tools that I had available to me at that moment were not working. They were not adequate. And nonviolent communication was an absolute sea change for me in my experience of navigating through conflict. And so I just got so deeply into it. Within a couple of years, I was giving the occasional presentation on it. I was helping other people apply it in their lives and in organizations. And so it's become an integral part of my work, as we mentioned earlier. And what's super exciting for me is that guy, that dear friend who introduced me to this stuff, is actually tonight's featured guest, my dear friend, Rob Gordon. So let me just introduce him and then sort of invite him to speak. Rob is a truly amazing, unique individual. He's basically sort of an all-around genius guy. I don't use the word lightly. I don't want to elevate expectations, Rob, but let's just say he's a really amazing creative thinker, philosopher. He's an entrepreneur. He's the head and the founder of the record label that I was on briefly. And he feels like a lifelong friend. I think we just figured out we've known each other since 1990. And most importantly for this discussion, he has, in the meantime, over the past couple of decades, really become an expert in nonviolent communication. He's applied it in his own relationships and also in crafting the culture, the work culture around his businesses. And so that'll be an interesting thing to kind of pick his brain about. So Rob, welcome. It's so happy to have you part of this discussion. And you just kind of go with us wherever you want to. Basically, how has nonviolent communication been effective in your life in sort of curbing that or transforming that sort of inner violence impulse, and how's it manifested in your work and your life stuff?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's great hearing that and giving me some inspiration to talk about as well tonight. Well, my search has been one of communication, one of how do I communicate with others and improve that efficacy. And along the way, I tried a lot of different things, and some of them sounded amazing. You're probably all familiar with the 4 Agreements. It's a very beautiful book with very simple ideas. But as soon as I heard that, I was like, yes, all those 4 ideas make total sense. Like, never assume. And then I just did it. And I was like, no, damn it. I didn't want to do that. Stop that. But I do it again and do it again. So yes, sure, there are these ideas that are great, but then how do I actually put those into practice? What's the way to implement these concepts? And so that became probably a decade or more long search of just sitting in conferences and reading books and listening to audio tapes and hearing different ideas of how people think people could communicate better. And then I saw Marshall Rosenberg do a live presentation. I was really lucky to get to see him a few times before he died. And his approach was fascinating. And all of a sudden, I had a how-to manual to what I already knew I wanted to do. But now here was a way that I could actually implement these ideals that I cherished and that I would see in other people and admire, and then look at myself and say, why am I not able to do that too? And so in nonviolent communication, I found a process and a concept, and extremely simple, but really hard to turn into my reality. So the more you hear about it, the more you study it, the more you listen to Marshall talk, if you listen to his audio books, you say, wow, that's so simple. And then you try and you're like, oh, wow, that is really difficult to do. And a lot of it is because our entire culture has grown up and developed around this concept. And Marshall even says it about himself. He says nonviolence, he used that because of Martin Luther King, but he thinks that that was the wrong name for this technology. He calls it a technology. He said he probably should have called it compassionate communication instead of nonviolent communication. And I love what you were saying, Dan, about how we see the world. One of the things that struck me as soon as I was really learning NVC was it talked a lot about how you hear other people and translate. It's a translation language. What is someone saying versus what do they mean? If someone says they're angry, then instead of hearing the anger, you hear the needs, you hear the feelings, you hear what's alive in them instead of a judgment or an attack against yourself. But immediately after that, as soon as I started practicing it, I realized the extreme power in NVC was our own inner violence, guilt and shame, and those feelings that we feel ourselves about our actions that we know are not in alignment with our intentions, and how we treat ourselves really violently. So for those of you who don't know, I'll give you a very quick overview of the process of nonviolence communication. It's only 4 things. It's observations, needs, feelings, and requests. And then needs and feelings kind of are interchangeable in order. So an observation without evaluation. You're not observing and finding blame. You're not evaluating. You're just, it's like you have a camera on a situation, and it would be like, for example, you always call me late, or you always show up late to your meetings. That's not an observation without evaluation. The always makes it an evaluation. So you would say very specifically, this last time that we got together, I had planned on seeing you at 12, you showed up at 12:15. It's non-judgmental. It still might be perceived by the other as judgmental. And that's the challenge of trust that you start to try to develop with people in nonviolent communication. And needs and feelings are not an I need you to, it's my needs. I have a need for. So let's go with this Dan was late to our meeting example because he was always so tardy. So Dan, you were 15 minutes late, and I really wanted to give you my full attention, but I have something in a half an hour, so I'm going to have to cut this short. And so I really I have a need for sharing, a need for being present with you. And then a feeling would not be like, I feel that's rude, because a lot of people would say feelings are outward. So in nonviolent communication, Marshall says all the needs and feelings are our needs and our feelings. They're not, I feel that you. It's not, I need you too. It's, I have a need for. I have a need for love. I have a need for sustenance. I have a need for safety. And there are only a handful of basic needs in the whole human language. And then the feelings are, I feel sad. It's my own feelings. I feel mad. That's fine. That's your feeling. But you're not mad at something. You just have a feeling. And then the last is the request. And the beauty of a request is it's a request in positive action language. You don't ask someone not to do something. You ask them to do what you would like them to do. So along the lines of this late example, it could be, I'd love to request that the next time we meet, would you be willing to come on time? Now, they're very new agey languages, and that's the challenge with nonviolent communication, because it sounds really touchy-feely and it's a little annoying, and it takes a long time. It's a slow process. But the beauty of the practice is that eventually you don't even use nonviolent communication. I don't use this process in direct communication with people very often. If I have an extreme situation, I might sketch out how I want that conversation to work and how I would pre-pave myself going into that next conversation, and then talk to someone with these ideas. I actually used this very successfully once with a band for my own nervousness, which they were kind of shocked by because I'm not typically a very nervous person. So in that late example, it's interesting too, because it could work in the benefit. I could say, hey, Dan, you were late this time, by 15 minutes and I need to tell you I'm really happy you were late because I need to finish my tax returns and I had this deadline today and I finally got to sign my documents. So thank you for your tardiness. Now, may I request in the future that you come on time? So it doesn't have to be a bad thing that we're talking about. Dan, is that a good?
Yeah, I love, that's a good example. I almost feel like we should have, maybe we could still do this, like do like an exercise where we like enact a situation with totally violent communication and then redo it with nonviolent communication. Sometimes they do that.
That's pretty easy. Dan, you fucking asshole. Why are you always late? Every time we get together, you're late and I have to move my meetings for you. And
right. I don't even like hanging out with you, Rob. So why you're in my face? I'm doing these lunches as a favor to you. Okay.
And it doesn't have to be so obviously violent.
We're so good at the violent talk. We should maybe stick to that.
No, we're great at it. And Kyle, who's my general manager at the company and has been with me since 1997 for the most part. We have both, I taught him a lot of nonviolent communication, and so much so that at a certain point he said, okay, can we just talk violent for a minute there and just shortcut, just get to it? Because we know that our intentions are nonviolent. So actually, once you trust, you have a trust with another person that you're both thinking nonviolently. You actually can use violent communication as a tool. Violent communication is only a problem when you don't have the nonviolent layer.
Yeah, it's funny, to me, almost every system, every approach, every religion, every philosophy has kind of a shadow side. And the shadow side of nonviolent communication that can be very passive aggressive, and that people actually hide behind the language. And your example of like it doesn't always have to be negative. If you're delivered with a different tone, it could be like, I'm actually really happy that you were super late because I had to do my taxes, but in the future, maybe try not to inconvenience me. The language itself is like, in a way, it's a beautifully constructed system of communication. But you're right, Rob, in the sense that like it's almost like more elevated than most humans. Even the people intentionally using the system have the capacity to do gracefully and sincerely. And so what often happens, and this was my experience early on, especially in my first attempts, because you're trying to stick to the script, and like I want to express, my feelings, based on whether my needs are being met and not do it in a blaming way. But I was using the nonviolent communication, and the family members that I was dealing with would respond, like just would mock it. You know what I mean? I would say like, I really feel a need for us to have some boundaries of respect between us. And like this person would say, well, I have a need for you not to be such a fucking hippie hiding behind your bullshit, new trendy, whatever you're doing to me, you're still a dick, And so you have to kind of learn to absorb that. And so this not using the language sometimes is a function of having developed trust with someone, but it sometimes is like realizing that if I just kind of use the principles, that's good enough, and what you said earlier about the listening has really been key for me. If you're really tuning into what's alive in someone, the way you said it, then it becomes a transformative experience. Just the acknowledgement, if you can somehow mirror back to them what they seem to be feeling, that has a magical effect on them, whether you use the language or not.
It's an iteration process. And if you start and you realize in NVC, that the biggest gains and the fastest gains are internal, they're within ourselves.
Right.
Then the next step is to utilize the concept to ask people questions in a way that helps them tell you what's really alive in them without them even knowing that you're doing it. So, you could say, hey, Dan, are you mad at this? What's going on with you? And you can iterate. When they tell you, you can say, and again, it can get new agey. Sounds like you're saying this, and they'll correct you, and they'll say, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this. And so there's nothing wrong with being wrong. It's really about iteration and find your way towards that, and trying to really hear what is alive in the other person, and then mirror that to them so that they can know that you hear that.
Yeah. Go ahead. There was one thing I wanted to add into that, but it sounds like you're not finished.
No, I was going to go and pivot into another area.
Okay, yeah. So, which is what I'm doing now. One way that I've found that anthroposophy helps kind of add a new dimension for me to nonviolent communication. When I was presenting on that, it was always nonviolent communication in the light of anthroposophy was the request moment, right? When you say, in the future, would you mind, it would really make my life great if you could try to show up on time. In anthroposophy, there's this extra layer where you first ask, before you ask something of someone else to change, positively or negatively, you kind of tune into yourself and you go, what is it about this thing that the person's doing that bothers me so much? And is there some way that I can shift or evolve within myself before I ask another person and sort of impinge upon their freedom? Is there some way that I can, that I can absorb this? Like, why does it bother me so much that Rob is always late? Why don't I just accept this about him and just say that I'll meet him at 12:30 and I'll just show up at 12:45 knowing he's going to be late, and then he can be who he is. You know what I mean? Like, so there's different ways to kind of find the application of this. But I think what you said that's most poignant is it's not about the rules of nonviolent communication. It's about learning to look at the world in a different way and to get past the feeling of being attacked, which is often because of the way we're trained to use language. Things feel like attacks, and then they aren't always that way. And often someone is actually expressing, like I said earlier, sadness. They're feeling sadness, but it's coming out as anger. And if you take it as anger and as an attack, then you're now in a fight with someone. Whereas if you say, it sounds like you're concerned about this, sounds like you're worried about this, sounds like you're really grieving this, and I feel that, and it's not a fake thing. You're just like helping them shift what's coming out as anger into a different place.
That's the compassion in compassionate communication. If they realize that you're trying to hear what's going on with them and what they're trying to express, and maybe helping them figure it out for themselves. A lot of times people don't know. They have a feeling, and in our culture, that feeling could just be anger. But they don't know what the trigger, and we are also really well trained at finding an external source for our internal feelings.
Absolutely.
We're really good at that. We're really good at turning our emotions outwards onto others and saying, and just from I love languaging, and I love the linguistic relativity, which effectively means there are flavors of this, but it's a philosophy that says that the words we use create the ideas that we think in, and when we think in these ideas, that creates the reality that we live within, and also our physical capacities. So an example of linguistic relativity would be, there's a tribe in Australia who only speak in absolute directions. They do not speak in north, south, east, west. They don't speak in right, left. They only speak in north, south, east, west. And in fact, the way they say hello in their culture is, where are you going? That's hello. That's the translation. And if you don't know where you are and where you're going, you literally can't answer hello. So if someone said hello to you in their culture, they'd say, where are you going? And you'd say, I'm going north, northeast in the middle distance. And the effect of that is they always know which way their body is oriented. Anywhere on the planet, in any room with no windows, they would know which way they're facing.
So in a way, sorry to come in, but it's in a way you're sort of giving one of the clues into how we might transform our culture and the way we think in the future. If we're looking at just the language, this is not much different from what I was saying about, defense in the ruse of offense. But you're on a really good trail there. But I also want to be mindful that, like, let's invite some other people into the conversation, because you and I could probably go on for 3 hours like this. Does anyone else? There's been some interesting comments in the chat that I could pick out.
Can I
Does anyone want to jump in?
Wait, I just wanted to just one other concept first that I think will be really helpful.
Okay, all right.
Marshall has said that there are 6 words and concepts that are, without those 6 words / concepts, violence could not exist within ourselves nor within our planet. We could not put ourselves in a position where we would ever feel a desire to be violent. And those words are right, wrong, good, bad, deserve, punishment. So if we couldn't believe that we were right and someone else was wrong, and that was a bad thing, and that they deserve punishment, we could not ever be in the mind frame to ever want to see someone else damaged or harmed, whether personally or across the world in a bomb. So I just wanted to share that. I think that's.
I'm glad you brought that in. That's a good way to wrap up that segment. So yeah, does anyone else feel like, doesn't have to be directly related, just has anything come up for anyone that they want to kind of chime in on? There's ML. Say something. Bring it.
Oh my gosh, this is so yummy. This is so yummy. Thank you both. And I just want to Vulcan mind meld with both of your brains and just like absorb all this. So this is, okay, I'm going to try to keep this tight. So I've written down some notes. So I noticed a couple things that came up as you were sharing about the concept of needs. So the idea of I have a need for, so critical, right? To be able to ask for what you need or to be aware of that. So what predicates all that is to have enough self-awareness to know what you need. And so many of us have, I feel like I've interviewed so many people about this. Our relationship to need sometimes is a long distance call. So we are often projecting onto other people what, we're asking them, like Dan was saying, we're asking them to do something instead of maybe absorbing, what is it about this that irks me? What is it in me? What need is unmet in my world, maybe that I could meet in myself? So I was thinking that I'm observation, needs, and requests. I thought, why are requests so hard? It's because sometimes we don't know what we need. And on top of that, our relationship to needs might be one that's shame-based. So that the fact that do I deserve to have something? Do I deserve to ask you to be on time? Am I allowed to put that out there on the table? I find that there is so much good, bad, right, and wrong binary thinking that even prevents us from having the conversation around making requests. So, and I don't know if that's I don't know if that varies by gender, sexual, hormones. I'm not really sure, but the relationship to requests I found and needs really is kind of what makes the application of what you're talking about either something that you can really take on or that holds you back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's cultural, and in terms of the cultural attributes, that has a huge, it leans a lot on language. Language itself has a massive impact on the way that we think about ourselves and the way that we think about others. I mean, they don't call them the romance languages for nothing. They actually do think in a more loving or sensual way. So the needs, like we're raised to start as a kid. We use words like, the child is like, we'll say to our friends, oh, your baby is such a good baby. We're not saying they're good, we're saying they're obedient. Really, like if we understand what we mean by the words that we use words very inaccurately. And so we're training these children from a very young age to be obedient, not to think for themselves, but to do what their parents say, to be quiet around people, to listen to their teachers, and the teachers are training us to regurgitate the answers that they teach us. And so by the time we get to be adults, we don't think we deserve what we need. We feel guilty. We feel like they even say like selfishness is taking care of yourself.
Yeah, and I want to add to that because ML, you sort of touched upon this. I don't think we can completely ignore the fact that there is some kind of gender element here, and with other topics that we've covered in Omega Male have sort of addressed this to a degree, like in terms of how men and women are raised differently. I know that self-assertiveness, for example, is something that's inculcated in boys, and not so much in women. Women are kind of culturally, again, this is a very broad statement, but I think it's defensible. Women are culturally trained in a way to be compliant and agreeable, and men are trained to be self-assertive and mark their boundaries and stuff. And so for a man to make a request, it's, I think, a different situation, and more is maybe asked of a woman to form a request like that, and different things play into it. I want to invite Micah to speak. We have the benefit of having someone here who's a trans man and might be able to speak in a more nuanced way about that experience. Like, what's the difference between experiencing the world in these different frameworks? Micah, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have anything to add that might either support or demolish what I'm saying here? It's really kind of theory in a way. And of course, that the invitation goes out to any women in the group that want to speak to that distinction of how men and women and people of various gender identifications might have a relationship to the self-assertiveness required to make a request?
Well, I have a million different thoughts, but since you specifically asked about that, my grandmother died last week, and so I was out in the public for the first time in a year, like getting on an airplane, and it was like so bizarre. And while I was sitting there, a man came up and somebody was in a seat, and he just said, "Hey, that's my seat." And the guy got up and they moved. And I was socialized female, and I didn't transition until I was 38. And so it just was so glaring to me how a woman would never handle that situation that way. And it wasn't like anybody's feelings were hurt, like they just handled it, but it wasn't a request. It was like, it was a statement or a demand. And if a woman needed the seat or noticed that somebody was in their seat, they would start with, "I'm sorry," or "excuse me," or they would maybe stand there and look confused for a few moments, and wait for something to happen so they didn't have to be assertive or make a request. So yeah, I think so much of it has to do with socialization. And I would say that men are far less equipped to do anything we're talking about because they are so shamed from such an early age, and so alienated from their own feelings, because really the only appropriate reaction is anger. You can't be like too happy or too excited or sad or scared. Certainly not scared. I'm a teacher and a counselor, and I continue to teach middle schoolers half time because I want them to learn about this. Like, I actually was teaching my students today about gender stereotypes, and about how unfair they are. But oh man, I just lost my train of thought. Was there anything in particular that anybody thought had a question about?
Well, that was a wonderful share, and I felt very supported in some of my things that I was saying theoretically from your actual experience. But when you started out, you said that you had some different thoughts. Was there anything off this particular topic that you wanted?
Oh yeah. So one of the things that I noticed is that pretty much in every domain that we're starting to talk about mental health, we're missing the foundation, the very basic skill, and it's like we can't see it, and that is emotion identification. And you are never going to even know that you have needs if you don't even know what the hell you're feeling. And so everybody, as far as I can see it, and this is why I'm thinking I want to do something in terms of helping people connect the dots with their own emotionality, because you can't do any of the work if first you don't even know what's going on for you. And so men especially are very detached from their feelings because, and that's people saying, "Oh, I'm not emotional." And it's like saying, "Oh, well, I don't breathe." It's like, yeah, you might be completely out of touch with your emotions. You might not know what's going on for you, but you're not emotional. So as a counselor and a teacher, it's like we are skipping that first step. Like, we can't talk about anything. We can't talk about needs. We can't talk about anything that we can't make requests if we don't even start with the initial data. What's going on for me? What am I feeling? And you would be surprised. I mean, I would say, and I, my adult clients, they're very intelligent, sophisticated people. And it's pretty shocking that, most people don't know how to label what they're feeling. They don't identify it first. And there was some research that showed that they did a scan, and they showed people in an fMRI really disturbing pictures, and they had one group name the feelings that came up while they were looking at the pictures, and the other group didn't. And the physiological response, the ability, the vagal nerve ability to like calm down the nervous system, and it just diminished the intensity of what was going on, of the entire experience, just by putting a label on the feeling. That's it. Not trying to calm yourself down, not trying to be like present or meditative, just like, this is this feeling.
Just naming it. Yeah.
Just name it. Yeah. You got to name it to tame it, right? That's who says that?
I like it. Name it to tame it. It's funny. It brings back to some of the things Rob was saying about nonviolent communication. In a way, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I've addressed in the previous sessions of this, and really revolve around, I guess, how we socialize children just from a young age, and what the world would be like if certain things were no longer divided into what's feminine and what's masculine, even, if all children understood that emotional self-awareness and self-expression, boys and girls, was not only healthy, but vital. But at the same time, in a way, we have a planet full of people that aren't children. Is it too old for the rest of us to learn that sort of stuff? And so in a way, I think nonviolent communication is a vital way in which adults kind of later in the game can kind of reach the kind of access that Micah's seems to be talking about, of just understanding, like, what am I feeling? If you're practicing hearing what other people are feeling beyond what their words are, and you're practicing, you're basically taking away what all of your normal defense mechanisms are of just going to blame, because anger wants to attack and blame and shame and all that stuff. And if you remove those voluntarily, and you remove the possibility of attributing your feelings to somebody else, you're just left with the feeling, like Rob was describing. You have to just say, I have this feeling, and that's your starting point. And I do think that's one of the sort of more nuanced, beautiful things about nonviolent communication. What do you think about that, Rob? Am I nailing that?
Yeah, and I love what Mike was saying. I think, one of the things that Marshall calls nonviolent communication is a needs-based vocabulary. And to improve that vocabulary in people, to add, I call nonviolent communication English 2.0. I just think of it as a layer on top, a layer on top of a layer. And what I would love to see is, and I've done this, and I've done this with people I work with and people I socialize with, is we practice eliminating certain words from our vocabulary. And it's not that easy. I've been practicing this for a long time, and I still say good and bad and right and wrong sometimes. But I really try to not think in those terms. Even I've been writing a document, that was the call I was doing before this, and writing a document and trying to take these words like that intimate pressure or needy, like if we don't do this, we're doomed kind of language. And to turn it more into inspired language, into aspirational language of what is the world we want to see, instead of what is the world that has sucked so much that it's inspired us. Well, we all know the shitty things about the world, so we don't need to talk about that. Let's talk about the inspiration side and where we're heading instead of where we've been.
Yeah, that's great. Christina, were you just waving, or you were just adjusting your shirt? It looked like you were raising your hand. Anyway, I want to now pivot a little bit to the other thing I was mentioning, which is what can we do in our own kind of inner development to kind of cultivate a disposition that's more conducive to peacefulness. And, originally I wanted to talk more about meditation and the role that's played for me, because I know for me, it's funny, Micah mentioned in the chat that, like, his body wants to, the presence of testosterone has impacted, how his body wants to respond viscerally with anger. So there's like things that are physiological about anger. And for me, part of that, almost related to that, is if I honored my meditation practice, and I literally will meditate on verses about, like, being a vessel of love in some way or another, I'm less likely to react in a particular way. And so that, I think that's like, I'm sort of non-introducing that, because something that's come up in this conversation for me that I think is a very potentially powerful healing practice that adults can do is this acknowledgement that most violence, a lot of violence, comes from people carrying on a pattern. Like, somebody who's been abused is more likely to abuse, right? If you're a child who was beaten by your father, you're more likely to come to school and beat on someone else. And so when I think of I was contemplating all of the instances where I've been the recipient of violence in my life. And I have had this practice of going back more and more consciously in a kind of intentional self-healing to try to, like, go back and re-envision these instances as a third person observer, and see if I can find an understanding of why this person behaved in this way towards me, because it's a way of actually releasing the damage from the violence. And then the more of this damage that I heal, and transform in myself, the less likely I am to have the impulse in the pattern of carrying it on. And I don't want to share every event of violence in my life, but I want to welcome other people to do that. But I can think of the very first time I was a recipient of violence. I must have been 6 years old in the schoolyard. And this kid came running across the blacktop, as we called it, and started pummeling me with his fists. I'm 6 years old. I was on the ground. This kid was punching like it was a, and then a similar thing happened just a few years later when I was 10 years old. I'd moved to Germany, and there was a kid in the schoolyard who just came up to me and just punched me. And like I was in a fist fight. I meanwhile, I'd learned a little bit about trying to fight back. And then in the same grade, it happened again with another kid. And so just those first few instances, I later, as an adult, realized these were all kids that were from socioeconomically underprivileged backgrounds. The first kid on the tarmac was a Black boy who'd been bussed into my very privileged white neighborhood as part of the school program of bringing in inner city kids. And the first kid who attacked me in Germany was a Greek kid, and the second kid was a Turkish kid. And I started realizing, like, I moved to Germany and I was an American, and I was from a foreign country, and I was being treated like a rock star there for being American because all the German kids loved America. And so these kids that were part of these work exchange families who were treated like shit because they were from Greece or Turkey, and they were treated like lesser people, looked at me and they're like, what's this guy? Like, why is this guy so special? He comes here from some country and everyone's like fawning all over him. And so they just, were angry at me. And they were probably had very stressful upbringings, with people who are having the stress of poverty and, living in a foreign country. So you start like realizing when you go over some of these experiences, I haven't had a single situation where the violence that I've suffered hasn't and I'm not saying it's excusable, especially when adults have attacked me, which has happened once or twice. But it's like, if you can somehow gain a broader understanding, it's easier to kind of like let go and pull out the dagger of this feeling of personally attacked. So I think that's been an interesting process for me. I wonder if anyone wants to share any personal story about how they've been either a recipient or even a committer of violence, and how that kind of perspective might change things. I don't know. I'm just sort of like opening it up to more personal anecdotes. It's not an easy thing to talk about. Oh, ML, what you got?
Okay, so this is so fascinating. So I went through menopause. I'm oversharing, but this has to do with the idea of relationship to hormones and anger and expression. So I felt my first experience of rage, of feeling rage and actually enacting, like hitting somebody after menopause, which is when your testosterone is more prominent because your estrogen drops. And it was like this light bulb that went off when I realized how many men have, between 4 and 16 more times testosterone than women. And here I am just getting a very small taste of what it's like to not know what I'm feeling, per Micah's comment, not being able to identify my feeling. And suddenly, instead of crying, which is what's socially acceptable for women and what I'd done most of my life when I was angry, it's the converse of what you were talking about. It's like tears are acceptable for women.
Right.
And then suddenly I have this, more prominent masculine energy, and I felt anger. And I was like, what is this? And I literally, I was ashamed. I was like, I can't believe I just hit somebody who does that. And I got beat up when I lived in Europe too. And I was like, just because I'm American, why does this keep happening? But I'd never actually felt that energy come out. So I just wanted to share it. It's very new to me, but it was, it's something I thought it would make me feel powerful, but it actually made me feel, I was so shocked. It was foreign to me. It was like, who's just taken over? So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Speaks to how much just our physiological condition informs our experience in the moment. I mean, this is sort of a gross example, but like, if you really have to go to the bathroom, it's like nothing else matters. If you've ever been stuck somewhere and there's no bathroom and you got to go, it's like someone could just, tell you your dog died and you're like, okay, I have to get to a bathroom right now. And we'll talk about that then. And so hormone levels are real. And there's so much that just physiologically informs where we're at. But in a sense, I don't look at that as a sort of condemning, well, this is just what we have to deal with. We're men, we have more testosterone, so, live with it. We're more aggressive. It's like, to me, the challenge is always the ultimate picture for me of human evolution is in somehow learning to transcend the kind of animal element. And I'm including that, just the physical body element. Like, what can I do to mitigate the influence of having testosterone going, or having adrenaline going, or feeling victimized or something? It's
I never really specifically tried to track the hormonal influence, but I have, and people who've known me for a really long time, you probably noticed this too, Dan, the intention to go from an aggressive New Yorker, and I've been told many times that I made a lot of my employees cry, both men and women, not out of intention, not because I was trying to make anyone cry, but I had just was so aggressive with my attitude towards what my goal was and how I would want to achieve it, as New Yorkers did. We were just very direct and very aggressive. And it wasn't the New Yorkers who I made cry, it was the Colorados, or the people who were out here when I was fresh out of New York off the boat into Colorado. And I decided I didn't want to be that person. And that was part of this travel and this journey. And so I think the people who know me before and after see a pretty dramatic change. I mean, I can be aggressive when I need to be aggressive for some purpose, but it's more of a tool now instead of the only tool in my tool case. It's kind of a tool of last resort. And so I think that regardless of these different hormones and attitudes, we have a huge amount of power in our intention. And by learning and adding different tools to our toolkit, nonviolent communication is a powerful tool, but it's only one of dozens and dozens of tools in my toolkit. And I'm always still looking for new ones. I found some other very powerful ones since. So I think I don't want to put a blame on and say, oh, well, we're destined to be violent because we have testosterone. I think that would be a falsehood. And every man wouldn't walk up to someone in the airport and just say, you're sitting in my seat. Every person is not stereotypically that way. We have a huge variety of how people are and would act.
Yeah, so, to me, this speaks to this notion that polarization is always problematic. The solution is never 180 degrees in the opposite direction. And human beings, like you're saying, are complex, and ultimately having a variety of having a kind of inner mobility is good for any human being. It's like you could be a super macho, manly guy, or much more, what's considered I always say you could be Jason Statham, or you could be Rufus Wainwright, or you could be Fred Armisen, or Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And all of these people, and the same for women and people of all genders, we're becoming increasingly diverse. We're becoming more and more unique and individuated in our individual expressions. But I think what is universal is that every human being, no matter what your gender, sexual preference, gender identity, level of sensitivity is, everyone benefits from being able to at times be firm, at times be like what you're calling sort of aggressive, maybe even, if someone's, attacking you, turning out the other cheek isn't always practical. If somebody's not hearing you in a particular way that you're communicating, pivoting to a different way of communication can be useful. And yet the more kind of expansive we are in raising children and encouraging each other to be certain ways and being emotionally attuned, the more we have kind of a rainbow of options in our communication. And I've had the same experience, Rob. I was in the middle of a conflict with someone that was very intense, and I was trying to approach it from a nonviolent communication point of view. And this person just stood up, you know, I was in a chair, came over and started poking the air in front of my face. And I realized at that moment I was improvising. I jumped up and I started poking the air in front of his face. And I said, you want to just yell at each other and do this? Because I could do this really well, you know? And it was kind of a very aggressive act, but I tried to do it in a humorous way. And he was sort of stunned. And then I, like, in that moment of stun, I was like, or like, we could just sit down and, like, you know, discuss this like adults, which is language that men can relate to, right? Sometimes you have to use the language of the person you're talking to. And that worked. And then I was able to move into more of a nonviolent kind of thing, but you can't just get too stuck on one way of being. And so that's where this plays into, like, raising our little girls to have boundaries and to know what self-assertiveness is, and raising our boys to understand what emotional self-expression is, and that it's okay to cry, actually. That kind of stuff. It looks like you were going to chime in. Seth, I see smiling. Seth, I know you got something to say. It's going to come at some point. I'm just inviting. Anyone else?
Okay, no, I appreciate that, Dan. So just because I like drama, I'm just going to push back on a few things that I heard you and Rob say. One, the idea of language being violent is an interesting idea that I'm curious about. Certainly in the cases where you're threatening someone, like, seems very much the case. But I wonder if, like, the idea of being offended, I wonder if you have to buy into that. Like, it feels like it's something you have to choose to be offended. Otherwise, people can just say words. So I wonder how language is violent. Another spot was martial arts being sort of a way to teach people how to, like, you know, maim or destroy or something. I've heard it theorized that if everyone knew martial arts, that we'd likely be disciplined, be likely to harness these feelings that do seem to be natural human, just release of energy, and three, it would also create a level playing field where you probably wouldn't want to mess with people if everybody knew how to be lethal with their hands. And then third, Rob used the 6 words. I thought was interesting. So I think it was something like, if you took those 6 words out of language, that there wouldn't be violence.
That the thoughts that make violence likely would go away. If I could not even think the idea that someone is wrong and bad and therefore deserves punishment, I couldn't put myself in a place where I would either act a certain way towards someone or support my government in taking an action towards another people.
Can I say something really quick about that, though? I mean, if we don't have those 6 words, then we also don't have the value that that makes us want to do nonviolent communication. Like, we have to have a value structure that says something is good and bad, in order to even want to, like, incorporate a new kind of speak. Why? Does that make sense? So there's like there's a paradox in even acknowledging in so much of this. There's, like, such a paradox.
Well,
like, for example, violence is natural. I think it's a matter of, like, when like, it's definitely there's more violence than there needs to be, but Mother Nature is not sentimental, and, you know, bears eat fish, and I mean, like, across the board.
But you're calling that violence. I wouldn't call that violence.
Well,
think that,
you can call it.
It might be aggressive. It might seem shocking, but
no, it's not shocking at all. I'm just saying that some of what we're talking about is value laden to begin with.
Value, yeah. I would go.
I would jump on that to say, I think it's always precarious that human beings do this a lot. We look to nature for examples of, like, what's legit. Like, sharks do this, so it's basically, this is nature's way. I would actually contend that human beings are in a way different from all of the other nature that's available to us on this planet, and that we have capacities that extend beyond a shark or a bear eating something in the woods, let alone a plant. And so we cannot justify or categorize or legitimize our behavior based on what we observe in nature. And Mike, you're not the only person to do this. People do this all the time.
That's not what I was doing, though. That's
okay. Yeah, then I may have
missed. That's not accurate at all. But go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. I will totally give the opportunity to recategorize that. But Seth brought so much interesting stuff, like a whole volley of different interesting challenges. As to the linguistic thing, Seth, I mean, you came in here saying, I like drama, but it's like, I think that sounds like bullshit to me. You're just, coming with this fucking undermining, aggressive ideas dressed up as intellectualism. And I think you're just being a dick and you're trying to thwart me. And, fuck you basically for coming into my thing that I invited you into and being an asshole and trying to make me look stupid. And of course, I don't mean any of this. I'm your dear friend. And I knew that, Seth could absorb that. But like, I just wanted to give an example of like how language can be and feel violent. You're my friend and you knew I was joking. And there must have been some part of you and some part of people who don't know our relationship that are, that felt something in just my saying those things,
Oh.
And what?
So I was even going to share like a real life example too of.
All right. I'm just going to ask you to let me finish my train here, but hold on to that. I want to hear it. But I get what you're saying, Seth, about the linguistic element, because we are in a culture, and you and I have talked about this, where taking offense has almost become like a kind of specialized art, right? And people take offense to things that aren't even remotely considered offensive by maybe an objective observer. And so you're sort of injecting into this, like, well, to what, is there any kind of room, is there any buffer zone where we're allowed to say things that that might be a little direct or that might be a little edgy? And I know that I say these things all the time, or at least in my personal relationships, and I have to sort of monitor myself. But I do think, so your point is well made in the sense that, like, again, the 180-degree response to, language can be violent. So let's monitor every word we say, and let's police every word that gets said. That's the culture we're living in now. And I agree, and I have a lot of the misgivings about it that you do. Although I would say it doesn't make me think, I think we should just have free reign with words because, like, we're being civilized enough. I don't know if this is what you were implying, but to me, like, drawing back from doing feuds and what am I calling, duels and banging each other with clubs, I still think that there's realm for human beings to grow in our communication where the art of talking to each other is like, let me put it as simply as possible. My philosophy about communication is try to be as sensitive on the output as you can and as insensitive on the input. Meaning, try not to take offense so much and try not to be offensive as much as you can. Does that make any sense? And this is only one of the things you raised. I didn't mean to make a categorical statement about the martial arts. I do think that on some level, there are probably ways in which men need to move this energy, and people, children, women too, like, I don't want to vilify any of those things. I just want to say that if we don't acknowledge them for what we are, if we don't say football is violent or boxing is violent, we just have to learn to parse these things. Is boxing healthy as an expression for, like, oh yeah, he was a child who had a lot of aggression, so he went into boxing? I'm not going to let my kid be a boxer if I have any say in it. So for me, there are some delineations in, like, what is a healthy expression of, like, the energy moving in us and what is not. I'm sorry, I don't want to roll there. Do you want to say something back to that, Seth? Because your points were strong.
I do, but I think it'll make for a pretty long conversation, and there's lots of people. And then I just wanted to finish off that third one to Rob about after the 6 words. Does that apply when it's like survival situation?
There are times, because of the culture that we're in already, that, like, I think about this in capital punishment. Are there some people where we can, Marshall was brilliant at this. He worked in the prison system with people, and he tells a wonderful story about this. And so are there people who are just too far gone? That would be a violent situation. Like, is the situation beyond one that can be handled right then in that moment in that way? But then we get into energetics. So, it takes 2 to tango idea of every victim and every perpetrator are energetically aligned to be the victim and perpetrator with each other. And it's a totally different idea outside of nonviolent communication. So it's hard to talk about this in isolation, because I would say in isolation, no. If someone's going to come and attack you in the moment, it might be good to just run and hide, or to defend yourself and punch. That might be appropriate with those tools. I guess it all depends on what kind of tools do you have in your toolbox. You know, Marshall tells a wonderful story of him being over at in a refugee camp in I don't remember what country, but he was traveling over in a refugee camp where Americans were bombing the culture that he was visiting, and so all their bombs had made in the USA on them, essentially, and so he was introduced to this camp as, you know, here's Marshall, he's from the United States, and people are like, go home, you know, just like really violent towards him and very angry at him. And he started using nonviolent communication to hear their needs, saying, so are you telling me that my country is putting you in a place where you feel unsafe, and like, yeah, you send your bombs instead of your food, and we don't need the bombs, and he keeps asking these questions and iterating towards, and by the end of the conversation, the person who started attacking him invited him to a Ramadan dinner. And it's a wonderful story. I mean, he has these stories after stories that make you cry. They're just so powerful of what he's done with just this one aspect of technology.
Christina, we're getting out the end. I know you wanted to jump in with something, so let me make space for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to, with Seth and the conversation of what you brought up of violent language and being offended. And personal experience, I grew up in a household with an older brother who would, and still to this day at times does, but, would tell me, I'd be in the front yard practicing for cheerleading tryouts, and he'd say, you're never going to make the cheerleading squad. Or I'd be singing in the car, and he'd say, shut up, you have the worst voice in the whole world. Even just this past week, and he told me that, me going on a date and then going to see my dad was that I was going to kill my dad. So now I know I grew up with my brother. I'm not, I don't get angry by it. I'm not offended by it. But it still hurts. It's still something that's painful to receive and wounding that it makes. But I'm not angry by it. I'm not lashing out. It's just something that, like, I have to kind of go into the external world to do my own healing with.
And it depends on how much it matters to you, like, how in your face is this? Is this something you deal with all the time? Or is this something when you were living in another state that you had such a so infrequent connection with that it really doesn't impact you? But so with NVC, you can utilize that to try and understand what's going on with him and why he says these kind of things by start asking inquisitive, clarifying questions. And the other powerful thing energetically is you can start pre-paving this to change the way it happens in the future, because wherever we left the topic energetically is where it is when we next approach it. So if I grew up in a summer camp, and we had a reunion, and I remembered watching all these adults, these people 20, 30 years later coming back to visit the camp where there were children and summer camp children with each other. And what I said back then, and this is 1991, so this is before I studied any of this stuff, and I remember so vividly watching them walk down the pathway into the camp and watching them reduce in size to the last age they were at camp, and then acting like they last were when they were at camp instead of acting like the adults that they are now. Same thing with high school reunions. So it's fascinating to me that energetically, if you don't address the energy, then it is wherever you left it. And so you could do a little bit of work within yourself, which has nothing to do with your brother, just independently, where you could pre-pave and start to see him in a different way, see him with more compassion in some ways, or see yourself in your relationship and redo that energetic agreement with him before you actually approach it the next time.
I wanted to say something really quick about what Seth was saying too. The reason that Marshall Rosenberg wanted to rename it nonviolent or compassionate communication is because when he says violent communication, he's talking about anything that's harsh. He's not talking about violence in the way that we conceptualize it.
Correct.
As a people.
Yeah, he's
And
not
so
talking about
that's
physical
that's why the name turns so many people off. And
Yeah.
I think that he realizes that it could have gone a lot further, because people are like, well, I don't have violent
Yeah, I'm not
communication.
violent. I'm not punching anybody. Why do I need nonviolent communication?
So
Yeah,
it's just
exactly.
really about being harsh. I think it's an overstatement that turns a lot of people off, but
Yeah.
I think it's an important distinction.
Absolutely. In
Was
these
it,
last few minutes,
were we
do we
going to
have-
8:30? What was?
Yeah, I'm just sitting with this. It's like there's so many wonderful people in this conversation, and even the ones who haven't spoken, it just feels like so inorganic to have to pull the plug on a conversation like
like a
this.
therapy session? Okay, next week we'll get angry again.
Yeah. So I know that it's part of the form to kind of honor the time frame, but and there's
Have another
Josh.
camera turn on. Josh
Yeah.
Ross too. Just turn
Josh.
it on.
Hey,
Yeah, you know what? I just want to just express my appreciation and love, real just love for everyone on this call, including the people that I just met. And it's just it's really an enriching experience for me to be able to kind of throw some ideas into the room, and to be met, for people to make space in their schedule at a weird time, no matter what time zone you're in, and to kind of support this process for me, and to be willing to engage in these conversations. And Seth, to be willing to sort of, like, you're always a great little bit of a challenger, and like for different people to bring in different ideas from their backgrounds. I always come out with something new in my own understanding. I always come up with new inspirations and new ideas. So for me, this really works, speaking very selfishly. And I want to thank Rob for making the time and being our guest and NVC expert. And just every one of you, for showing up. And this has been just a wonderful thing. We have one more officially scheduled session in a month. And I don't know what our future is after that, but like, WeDeepen's just been a wonderful platform. These have been wonderful things for me. I'm happy to continue any of these conversations. Any of you who do or don't have my contact information, I'm on Facebook under Daniel Mackenzie. Hit me up on Instagram, which is, I think, on my little tag here. Anyone who wants to continue the conversations, I'm open to it. And but I guess we have to wrap it up for now. Does anyone have any last little things they want to say or throw into the space before we say goodnight? Do so now, or forever hold your peace, or for a month hold your peace.
I'm so glad we had this time together. You know that one?
Oh, what's that?
Carol Burnett, the old Carol Burnett goodnight. She forever ear. And say, I'm so glad we had this time together, just to have a laugh or sing a song. It seemed like just before we started. And then before you know it, it's the time we have to say so long.
Classic Rob.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. And it was so nice to meet you new people, and to see you old people.
Well,
Thank you, everyone, too. I dropped in the chat, there's a survey link. Unfortunately, right now, there's a connection error as I'm trying to send it to you by email. So you may get this by email again. But if you just pull this link up in your browser and have it there, and take 3 minutes, it's super helpful for us, both Daniel and I, to get the feedback. And we really appreciate you coming. You can see the schedule, WeDeepen.com. We have been in a little bit of an exploration phase, I guess, over the past year. Can you guys believe this has been, we're hitting the exact year mark of when we went into quarantine 2020. And thought it was going to be a couple of weeks. We were doing in-person experiences, and we've been trying out this virtual space. And figuring out how we continue to deepen and to create authentic relating experiences and human connection, and have these deep conversations. And appreciate you guys all tuning in through the internet. And we look forward to be back together in person. And I don't know what's going to come. We might do a WeDeepen festival. We're going to be launching a peer-to-peer, member-to-member coaching platform with inside of the community. So please stay tuned. And it's all unexpected, our I wouldn't say unexpected. The vision's there, but we don't know the interworking of how this is all going to play out, how Deepen is all going to play out. So you're in this with us, and I appreciate you. I appreciate Daniel and Omega Male, and this has been a great experience, and it's going to continue, Omega Male for sure, and it's a pleasure to see you all.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Let's be in touch. Have a good rest of the evening, and I feel truly blessed. You guys are awesome.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Rob. You guys both are the best.
Thanks.
Love you.
Love you.
Love you.
You, all of you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.